Good morning. My name is Rachel Lawler, and I am a survey analyst with the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring our latest PPIC statewide survey on Californians and their government. Today's event is supported with funding from the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle. The survey was supported with funding from the R.J. and Francis F. Miller Foundation and the James Irvine Foundation. We thank them for their support. For today's program, my colleague, Dean Bonner, will walk you through some of the key findings from the survey, and then we will discuss some of our main takeaways and answer questions from the audience. Before I introduce my colleague, I have a couple of housekeeping items. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. And if you have a question about the survey, please send an email to the address that's on the screen. That's ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Please make sure to include your name and organization along with your question. And I would now like to welcome my colleague, the Associate Survey Director and Research Fellow, Dean Bonner. Dean.
Thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to go ahead and get started by sharing my screen. So today's survey is part of the Californians in their government series, but I do want to talk more broadly about the PPIC statewide survey. The mission of the survey is to provide relevant and timely nonpartisan data on issues of the day that are critical for informing policymakers, encouraging discussion, and raising awareness. Since 1998, we've completed about 200 surveys, and we've given a voice to more than 400 Californians. As I said, this particular survey is part of the Californians in their government series, and this survey series has been going on since 1999 on state and national issues, looking at public perceptions, attitudes, and policy preferences. This survey was conducted on both cell phones and landline phones, and we talked to about 1,700 Californians, including nearly 1,200 likely voters. About 3/4 of the interviews were conducted on cell phones, about 1/4 on landline phone. And the survey was fielded in mid-May as California voters prepare to send in their ballots or go to the ballot box on June 7th for the primary, and as inflation and gas prices continue to impact residents of the state. Additionally, we are in the midst of yet another increase in COVID cases, and Californians are currently being asked to conserve water due to drought conditions. Now, to start off, I would like to talk about what issues Californians name as most important when they're asked an open-ended question, just what's the most important issue facing the state. And today we find that about 1 in 3 Californians name either economy, inflation, or gas prices as the most important issue, while 1 in 5 name either housing or homelessness. And in total, that means that nearly 6 in 10 Californians are mentioning issues focused on the economy, rising prices, or housing. The economy and inflation is the top issue across parties, regions, and demographic groups today. I would like to say that it is notable what's also missing from this list. Today, we find that just 2% of Californians name COVID as the most important issue facing the state. This is notable given that the last 2 times we've asked this question or a similar question, about 1 in 5 has named COVID as the top issue. In February, 12% named the economy, while about 1 in 5 also named homelessness and housing. Last May, we found that jobs in the economy was the top issue, with 1 in 5 naming that, while 16% named COVID. So it is a big fall when it comes to mentioning COVID. And when we ask people whether or not the state is going in the right direction or the wrong direction, we actually find that just about half of Californians are pessimistic about the direction of the state. When we last asked this question, we found that findings were actually reversed with about half saying right direction and 45% saying wrong direction. And it's notable that, dating back to September 2019, Californians have generally been more likely to say right direction than wrong direction when asked this question in periodic surveys. And indeed, we haven't seen this level of pessimism among residents since December 2012. So it's been quite a run since we've had half of Californians saying the state's headed in the wrong direction. And the share who are optimistic about the direction of the state only eclipses 50% in the San Francisco Bay Area, among Democrats, among college graduates, and among Asian Americans. So it's a very widely held belief that the state is headed in the wrong direction. There's a noticeable partisan divide on this issue, with nearly 9 in 10 Republicans and 6 in 10 independents saying the state is headed in the wrong direction, compared to about 1 in 3 Democrats who say that today. And turning to personal finances, today we find that 2 in 3 Californians say that rising prices are causing hardship for their household, while 36% saying this hardship is serious. These findings are basically unchanged from March, where we saw a similar level of Californians saying hardship overall, as well as saying that the hardship is serious today. About half of residents with incomes under 40,000 say their household is experiencing serious hardship, while nearly half of those with incomes above 80,000 say that they're not experiencing hardship at all. Half of Californians say that recent price increases have caused serious hardship, compared to about 4 in 10 independents and about 1 in 4 Democrats. And in fact, the share of Republicans who say that their hardship is serious due to rising price increases has actually increased 10 points since March. Across regions, we find that nearly half of residents in the Central Valley say rising prices are causing serious hardship, and this makes them the most likely to hold this. And that's compared to about 1 in 4 in the San Francisco Bay Area who say that, and they're the least likely to hold this view. And when we ask Californians to compare their personal finances to a year ago, we find that very few Californians say that they're better off than a year ago, while about half say that their finances are about the same, and more than 1 in 3 say that they're actually worse off today than they were a year ago. When we last asked this question about 6 months ago, this share saying they were better off is down slightly, while the share saying they were worse off has increased 19 points. We find that 6 in 10 Republicans say they're worse off, making them far more likely than independents and Democrats to say this. And the share saying they are worse off increases with age and is much higher among those with incomes of 40,000 or under. And while personal finances seem to be definitely on Californians' mind today we actually find a record low share of Californians call the state budget situation a big problem. And illustrative of how widely this view is held, fewer than half across parties, regions, and demographic groups said that the budget situation is a big problem, with the lone exception being Republicans, where 7 in 10 actually called the budget situation a big problem today. And by comparison, just 1 in 4 Democrats and 4 in 10 independents call the budget situation a big problem. And while there is mostly agreement about the overall budget situation, opinions on how to spend the surplus budget funds, we find that Californians are more divided. As you may have heard, the May revise brought with it news that the budget surplus had ballooned to nearly $100 billion. And when asked how they would prefer to spend these budget funds, a plurality of 1 in 3 say they'd like to increase state funding for education, health, and human services, while 1 in 4 want to refund some money to the people of California. 1 in 5 prefer one-time spending for transportation, water, or infrastructure, and fewer would prefer to build up the reserve. We find that the top choice among Democrats is increased education HHS funding, while the top choice among Republicans is refunding some of the money back to the people of California. And in fact, 6 in 10 Democrats actually mentioned increased funding for education HHS or one-time spending for infrastructure, while about 6 in 10 Republicans say they want to refund some of this money back to the people of California or build up the reserves. And across racial ethnic groups, Latinos clearly favor more education and HHS funding, while members of other groups are actually more divided. And as part of his May revise, Governor Newsom proposed an $18 billion funding proposal to address inflation, with most of the funding going towards tax rebates for vehicle owners and free public transportation for 3 months. And when asked about this proposal, 6 in 10 Californians and over half of likely voters are in favor. As expected, and as you can see, there's a wide partisan divide here. Outside of parties, we find that majorities of regions and demographic groups are in favor. However, there are some differences across subgroups. For example, women are 10 points more likely than men to be in favor. And while 3 in 4 Latinos and 2 in 3 African Americans and Asian Americans are in favor, just half of white Californians are actually in favor. And support for this proposal to address inflation actually decreases, support decreases with rising income. And turning to a totally different topic, we continue to track Californians' views when it comes to the situation in Ukraine. And when asked about support for sanctions against Russia, today we find that 7 in 10 Californians support the idea of sanctions. However, support falls to 49% if this leads to higher energy prices. In March, a similar 76% supported sanctions, including 56% who said they support these sanctions, even if it means higher energy prices. Support for sanctions, even if higher energy prices, is higher among Democrats than independents and Republicans. And support for these sanctions is much higher among whites and other groups, and it declines with rising age, education, and income. And as the U.S. debates what level of support to provide Ukraine, and with Congress recently passing $40 billion more in aid to Ukraine, we find that Californians themselves are somewhat divided when it comes to how much support should be given. We find a plurality of 35% say the U.S. is providing about the right amount of support. However, a similar 32% are actually unsure how they feel about this issue overall. Across parties, Democrats and independents are more likely than Republicans to say that we're providing about the right amount of support. And we find that pluralities across regions and demographic groups think the U.S. is providing about the right amount of support. But it is noteworthy that more than 1 in 5 across these groups actually say they're unsure about how they feel on this topic. And turning to the midterm elections and who likely voters in California might support in the 2022 election for the House of Representatives, we find that just over half of likely voters say they would vote for or lean towards voting for a Democratic candidate, while about 1 in 3 would prefer a Republican candidate. Findings today are similar to May 2020 and 2018, but the margin between support for Democrats and Republicans is wider than it was in March, when 51% favored the Democrat and 42% favored the Republican. And in true fashion, most Democrats prefer the Democratic candidate. Most Republicans prefer the Republican candidate. And while not as strong as partisanship, 6 in 10 likely voters in Democratic-held districts, currently Democratic-held districts, support a Democrat in 2022, while the reverse is true in Republican-held districts. Today, we find that women are 14 points more likely than men to prefer a Democratic candidate, and this preference for a Democratic candidate increases sharply with educational attainment. We also find that majorities in Los Angeles, Orange, and San Diego, and the San Francisco Bay Area prefer a Democratic candidate, while those in the Inland Empire prefer a Republican candidate, and those in the Central Valley are currently divided. And with a leaked draft opinion from the Supreme Court showing that Roe v. Wade may be on the verge of being overturned, we wanted to gauge what role this decision might play in the midterm election. And we find that likely voters, by a 4-to-1 margin, are more likely to support a candidate who wants to keep Roe in place, while about 1 in 4 say it does not matter very much. We find that about half of independents and 8 in 10 Democrats would be more likely to vote for a candidate who wants to keep the landmark decision in place, while a plurality of Republicans prefer a candidate who wants Roe v. Wade overturned. Across regions, likely voters are more likely to prefer a candidate who wants to keep Roe v. Wade in place, but this perception is much higher in the San Francisco Bay Area, Orange, San Diego, and Los Angeles than in the Inland Empire or the Central Valley. It's notable that 2 in 3 women, compared to about half of men, are more likely to support a candidate who wants Roe v. Wade kept in place. This is especially noteworthy because in our April survey, men and women had similar views when asked a question about whether or not Roe v. Wade should be overturned or kept in place. So this is definitely something we'll be continuing to watch. And we continue to track how Californians feel about the elected officials, both at the state and the federal level. And today we find that about half of Californians approve of Governor Newsom, the state legislature, and President Biden, while about 1 in 3 approve of Congress. There is a wide partisan divide on each of these approvals. And across all of these ratings, approval is higher in the San Francisco Bay Area among women, as well as among Latinos and Asian Americans compared to other groups. And at this point in time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Rachel to come back to, and discuss some key takeaways. But before she does, I would encourage you all to ask some questions. You can do so by sending your question as well as your name and organization to ppiceventquestion@gmail.com. So Rachel, I know there's a lot here, but I'm really curious to find what things you found interesting and what were some of your key takeaways.
Sure, and thank you so much, Dean. That was a really fantastic summary. Having worked with you on this survey, I know, like you mentioned, we have so many interesting topics to choose from to include in the briefing, and I think you did a great job highlighting a lot of the important findings that are related to critical issues for Californians today. I did want to briefly talk about some of the other topics in our survey that you weren't able to cover just due to the time constraints today. First, I wanted to take a look at some findings on the direction of the country as a whole. As you mentioned, Dean, half of Californians think things in the state are going in the wrong direction and just 45% say right direction. And you also mentioned that that's the highest share saying wrong direction since December a decade ago. And I believe you mentioned the partisan differences on this question as well, with most Democrats saying right direction and most Republicans and independents saying wrong direction, which is pretty typical for our findings on a particular topic. However, I think you can maybe argue that those views are optimistic compared to how Californians feel about the US. We did find a solid majority, 63%, saying the country is going in the wrong direction, and just 30% saying it's going in the right direction. And things look even more dire among likely voters, where we find 73% saying wrong direction and just 23% saying right direction. And that's the highest share of likely voters saying wrong direction in our surveys since August of 2008. This is similar to what we find with the direction of the state. This is a question where we typically find a large partisan divide, often with the party in control in Washington generally approving of the direction, while the party out of control generally disapproves. This was the case as recently as September of last year, when a majority of Democrats said the country is going in the right direction and an overwhelming majority of Republicans said wrong direction. However, this isn't the case. This isn't what we find today. We actually see a partisan agreement that the country is going in the wrong direction. We find 61% of Democrats, 3/4 of independents, and 90% of Republicans saying that it is going in the wrong direction. And I think that's noteworthy since we don't often find partisans agreeing on much, especially in California. And if we dig a little bit deeper into how Californians are feeling about the nation, we find that 7 in 10 think the US will have bad times financially in the next year, while only 22% say we will have good times. And this sentiment is also widespread in that we don't find a majority of any partisan, regional, or demographic group saying that the country will have good times. I don't think this is necessarily surprising, given that we know the economy and inflation are the top concern for Californians, and that 2 in 3 report experiencing some level of financial hardship due to the recent price increases. So if we take that together, although Californians tend to be more optimistic about their home state's circumstances, pessimism is certainly prevails when it comes to how they think about the country as a whole. And I think that's definitely worth mentioning because of the upcoming midterm elections, which obviously include Governor Newsom's reelection bid, and the potential impact that this type of sentiment may have on voters' decisions on election day. Another finding I wanted to briefly mention that I think also gives us some insight into the current mindset of Californians is the topic of whether the state is divided into economic subgroups of the haves and the have-nots. And we find that an overwhelming majority of adults, 71%, say that it is divided into these two groups, while just 1/4 say that it is not divided into haves and have-nots. And that's a record high share, saying that the state is divided this way since we first started asking this question in 1999, so over 2 decades ago. This is another area where we see broad agreement with majorities across partisan, regional, and demographic groups saying that California is divided into the haves and have-nots. And if we take it one step further, we asked respondents whether which of these 2 categories they feel that they personally fit into. And we found that 45% said they are in the have-nots, while 39% said they're in the haves, and 10% actually volunteered the answer that they don't feel that they fit into either of those groups. There are some very different and I think notable differences between subgroups that I wanted to call attention to. The first being the difference among adults and likely voters. Unlike adults, we find that at 49%, likely voters are more likely to place themselves in the haves group, while at just 36% classify themselves as being part of the have-nots. And that actually aligns with previous PPIC research, where we found that California's electorate tends to be more affluent than the population in general. There is a bit of a partisan divide here, with most Democrats putting themselves in the haves, while Republicans are more divided about where they fit in, and independents are more likely to say that they are in the have-nots. There's also quite a substantial gap between racial ethnic groups, where we find about half of Asian Americans and whites placing themselves in the haves, while just 28% of Latinos and 23% of African Americans do the same. We also find that Californians in households without children are generally split on which group they belong to, while a slim majority of those living in households with children actually classify themselves as part of the have-nots. Additionally, we find that the share saying that they are in the haves increases as educational attainment and income levels increase. And finally, most homeowners consider themselves to be in the haves, while renters tend to say that they are in the have-nots. So although there's broad agreement that California is divided into these two subgroups, there are some very wide disparities when it comes to which group people view themselves as being a part of. And I think that could have some larger implications when it comes to how they view the current state of affairs, both in California and the United States. So Dean, I don't know if we wanted to mention anything else on those topics, or if not, we can move right on to the Q&A with the audience.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that, the shares saying that the state is divided in the haves and have-nots is at a record high, and it's consistent with other questions that we've asked, right? Is the gap between the rich and poor getting wider? Do they foresee the gap getting wider in the next 5 years? And so these are all things that we've consistently found that Californians think that there is this gap. And at least from a policy standpoint, it's good that when we ask Californians, should the state be doing more to address this gap, in most cases, we do see pretty broad-based support for more state action to address this. So that at least is a little bit of a glimmer of hope. But it's definitely, income inequality and poverty is an issue that will definitely, continue to dominate the state. But yeah, and of course the U.S. findings are just really, really, really interesting. It's notable that the likely voter number today is lower than where, regarding good economic times, regarding, we had the Great Recession, and it never got this low. And so Californians' pessimism about the economy really does stand out to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great points, Dean. So we're going to go ahead and move on and answer questions that the audience has sent in. And as a reminder, it's not too late to submit a question. If you have one, please send them to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Again, make sure to include your name and your organization. And we can go ahead and start with this first question that came in. The survey provides a look at how Californians are thinking about the 2022 midterms, including the House races. Are there any notable regional breakdowns on the midterms outlook?
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it, Dean.
Yeah, it's a great question. I touched upon it briefly in the presentation, but I do think it's noteworthy that, in Orange, San Diego, you have half preferring a Democrat, and that's a 13-point advantage. In Los Angeles, 59% prefer the Democrat, and that's a 32-point advantage for Democrats. And in the Bay Area, you have 2 and 3, 67% preferring Democrats among likely voters, and that's a 41-point gap. So there's some wide gaps in some of the more Democratic leaning areas of the state, while in the Central Valley it's closely divided, 45% for the Republican, 42% for the Democrat, while in the Inland Empire, there's a slight preference of 8 points in favor of the Republican. And so we know that some of these close races in recent years have been in Orange, San Diego. And so that's something that we definitely want to continue to watch. Currently over half are saying Democrat, and so it will be something that we especially will be conscious of, given some of the races that we know are kind of competitive down in those Southern California districts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to keep an eye on that. As we know, California lost a seat in the House of Representatives, so these races are proving to be will be very consequential in November. So that's a great point. We have another question here. What is your take on why Bay Area residents have a more favorable view on the state's direction than do residents of other regions? I can offer a couple thoughts before you take over, Dean. I know, at least throughout this survey and other surveys, there are often views in the San Francisco area can be quite different from elsewhere, and that's what we're seeing here. We did, in this survey, find residents in the Bay Area to be more approving of the governor, the legislature, as well as President Biden, and they're also more likely to think the U.S. is going in the right direction. I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, but I know they're the least likely to say they've experienced any type of financial hardship in terms of the regional breaks. And they're also the most likely region to put themselves into the haves. So as I was talking about the haves and the have-not groups. So I think there's some different things at play here, but in the current environment, what that says to me is we know that area there typically tends to be a little bit higher wages than a lot of other areas of the state. And because of that and being less affected by the price increases, they may just be feeling a little bit less pressure than residents living in some other places in the state. So that may be affecting their views and making them a little bit more positive than folks living elsewhere. So Dean, did you want to expand at all?
Yeah, those are all great points, especially how they're perceiving the recent price increases, the haves and have-nots. And I also think it's somewhat a matter of demographics. When you look at the groups that are more likely to say that the state's headed in the right direction, the Bay Area tends to have a higher share of those folks, whether that be Democrats, who we saw 62% said that the state's headed in the right direction, or whether it be college graduates, which we know the Bay Area has a higher share of college graduates, 54% say right direction, as well as Asian Americans. They have the highest share of Asian Americans across any of the regions, and Asian Americans are actually very optimistic about the direction, with 59% saying that they're actually think the state's headed in the right direction. And so I think it's just a matter of kind of both how Bay Area residents are experiencing these recent price increases and gas prices, as well as kind of the demographic makeup of the Bay Area itself as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that expansion, Dean. Okay, we have another question here. So Dean, I know you talked about the proposed spending package to address inflation that Governor Newsom has released with his May revision. And the question is, what does your survey say about how concerns about rising prices might be affecting views of the governor or President Biden?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, if we kind of piece together two pieces of data, on the one hand, we do know that lower income folks are kind of the most likely to be impacted by rising prices, the most likely to say that their finances are worse off than a year ago. However, they're also the most likely to both approve of Governor Newsom as well as President Biden to a lesser degree, and they're actually more likely, the most likely by a fairly wide margin, to support the governor's plan to address inflation. And so while kind of these rising prices may be impacting different groups differently, some of the groups that are being hit the hardest by these rising prices are actually among the most approving of the governor, especially. And so it does seem like that, at least among those groups, we aren't really seeing kind of a hit on the approval of Governor Newsom or President Biden. And if you look, the approval of both Biden and Newsom has been pretty flat in recent months, and so it's holding steady. And so I do think that what you're seeing is that that Californians about half of Californians continue to approve, despite this kind of wearing of the impacts of inflation and gas prices.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. The views, how they align with the income, but they're most approving. It's really an interesting point. All right, we have another question. This survey shows support for sanctions against Russia being slightly lower than in March. Why do you think this is? I can start off with this one, Dean. When I took a look at the data, I noticed the place where we saw I don't want to say it's a big decline, but the most movement was among those who said that they would support the sanctions even if it caused higher energy prices. And since we asked that question in March, there's obviously been a substantial increase in gas prices. And to me, I think that might be why we are seeing a little bit of decline in support for the sanctions. I know in California, on average, gas costs more than $6 a gallon. And that's the highest in the country, I believe, unless it's changed today, and I haven't looked at it yet. But I think residents are really, they're feeling that, and they're starting to, maybe reconsider their position a little bit. And obviously, we still find an overwhelming majority want sanctions, but if it's going to impact energy prices or gas prices further, I think they may be reconsidering, just because it is really hitting them in the pocketbook. Yeah,
that's definitely, I think, a good point, that the decline has been higher among kind of the groups that are the even if group, right? But I was curious, and so I actually looked at this last night, and kind of the idea of where the change is coming from. And so when I looked at just the share who are saying they support even if it leads to higher energy prices, it was interesting that a lot of the groups tended to be kind of more liberal groups. So for example, the share among Democrats has declined 10 points since March. The share in the San Francisco Bay Area has declined 20 points since March. We saw a 10-point decline among women, a 10-point decline among college graduates. And so that to me was interesting. I was expecting perhaps there to be a bigger change among lower income folks or among kind of lesser educated folks, potentially because of the price increases would hit them harder. But what I actually found is that it was among some of the groups that were less likely to say that rising price increases are causing them hardship. And so that I do kind of want to dig into that a little bit deeper, because I do find it interesting kind of where the change is coming from, at least on that kind of support, even if energy prices were to go up. And so that's something that was really interesting, and I do want to dig in a bit more.
Yeah, and I think it will definitely be interesting if we ask this question again in the coming months, and if gas prices continue to stay at this level or go up, to see if that has any effect on it, and just any changing circumstances, since things are rapidly evolving on a day-to-day basis, both in Russia and lots of other issues. So definitely keep an eye on that. Okay, we have another question that I think is a good one, since Dean, you talked a little bit about both Biden and Newsom's approval ratings kind of holding steady in the past few months in California. So the question is, President Biden's approval ratings are slipping at the national level. What do you make of the fact that they seem to be holding steady in California?
Yeah, well, they're definitely falling nationally much more than we're seeing here in California. But while they're holding steady, in recent months, I think if you look back to last May, we've actually seen a 16-point decline. And so there's been that big decline over time, but they could be holding steady in California because of the fact that nearly half of Californians are registered, more than nearly half of registered voters in California are registered Democrats. And so there's a kind of a floor that you would see in support, considering that most Democrats are approving of President Biden, right? And so at the national level, even if you have most Democrats still being approving, the floor of how low it can go is much lower nationally because of the share who identify as a Democrat is lower than when you look at registered voters in California. So I think that's definitely having an impact, because if you start off with, say, 90% of 45% of California registered voters, then it's hard to drop too far unless you start seeing a decline in support among Democrats, which we really haven't seen as much of a decline among Democrats, or really any substantive decline among Democrats compared to other groups. And so I think that he's enjoying that approval of about half here, mostly I think because of the share of registered voters who are Democrats here, whereas nationally we just don't have that.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with that one, Dean. All right, so we have time for one last question. This one is a little bit more open. Was there anything that surprised you about your findings?
Well, as because I always like to have an answer to this question because it's very popular among reporters and among our kind of guests on these webinars. And I do find some of the findings regarding the question around a candidate who would support, who would keep Roe v. Wade in place versus preferring a candidate who would want Roe v. Wade overturned. And kind of two things came to mind. First of all, the findings among the Republicans, I think, are interesting, that while you have a plurality say they are more likely to support a candidate who wants to see Roe v. Wade overturned, you do have 27% of Republicans saying that they would prefer a candidate, or more likely to vote for a candidate who wants Roe v. Wade kept in place, and another 1 in 4 saying that it doesn't matter. And so I really want to dig into that and look at different subgroups among Republicans to kind of see who's more or less likely to hold these views. The other thing that's really interesting is kind of differences among men and women, and comparing that to how they felt when in April, when we asked just an overall, do you want to keep Roe in place, or would you prefer Roe v. Wade be overturned? So when we asked that in our April survey, we found 76% of men and 81% of women saying they would prefer that Roe v. Wade be kept in place. However, when you look at who's more likely to support a candidate who wants Roe v. Wade kept in place, we find that 2 in 3 women are more likely to support a candidate who wants Roe v. Wade kept in place, while just 48% of men say they want a candidate who wants Roe v. Wade kept in place. And so I think that dynamic will be interesting to follow, as well as some of the findings among Latinos who were more likely to say they wanted Roe v. Wade kept in place, but when it came to the candidates, they were kind of a little bit more divided regarding whether they preferred a candidate or would be more likely to vote for a candidate who wanted Roe v. Wade left in place. And so those are obviously two big groups of folks that will play a role in midterms. And so I think on this issue of kind of Roe v. Wade and the midterms, much more is left to be discovered beyond just their vote choice. But will this make them more likely to turn out? Does it just not matter to certain groups or other groups? So I think that's where there'll be some interest moving forward on this topic. Is there anything that surprised you, Rachel, in the few minutes we have left?
Yeah, I know there's a few things. One that comes to mind. I was actually a little bit surprised that just 27% of Californians said that they would prefer the surplus be used to refund some money to Californians. I would have expected that to be higher given inflation and gas prices. So, I mean, all of the choices that we listed, I think were worthy items that definitely attract people to want to fund them. But at the same time, like I said, just given the environment, I would have expected that to be higher. So that's one that kind of comes to mind right away. So. Yeah. All right, well, we are at the end of our program, and I would like to thank you, Dean, for that great presentation and conversation. I'd also, again, like to thank our survey funders, and finally to all of you for joining us today online. If you pre-registered for this event, you are going to receive a survey later today, and we would really, really appreciate you taking a couple minutes to respond to it and let us know how we did. So again, thank you. Please be safe and have a good afternoon.